Hello and welcome to today's ICMA University Web Conference, Promoting Solar Energy Use Through Local Planning, putting solar energy use on the local policy agenda. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Ann Dillamus, Research Associate at the American Planning Association. Ann, if you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Amelia. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Putting Solar Energy Use on the Local Policy Agenda, which is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy's SunShot Solar Outreach Partnership. The Solar Outreach Partnership, or Solar Ops for short, is a DOE initiative designed to increase the use and integration of solar energy in communities nationwide. The partnership's activities include outreach, educational programs and materials, and technical assistance. You can learn more about the partnership and its activities by visiting the Solar Ops website at solaroutreach.org. This webinar is the first in a three-part series on the theme of promoting solar energy use through local planning. The series is rooted in a recent set of American Planning Association briefing papers, which are available at the web address shown on screen, along with a number of other APA resources related to planning for solar. After today's webinar, the next program in the series will be on September 20th, and the discussion will focus on incorporating solar supportive policies into local plans. The final program in the series will be on November 1st, and it will tackle the subject of solar-friendly development regulations. One of the core purposes of local planning is facilitating the development or protection of community resources. Yet relatively few local plans or the development regulations that help implement them acknowledge solar energy as a resource comparable to other local resources such as vegetation, water, minerals, fossil fuel reserves, or historical buildings and heritage sites. The purpose of today's webinar is to help explain why it is important for communities to plan for solar energy use and to offer guidance to planners, public officials, and solar advocates to help them initiate and facilitate conversations about solar in their communities. The last part of our program is devoted to your questions. As Amelia mentioned earlier, throughout the webinar, you can submit your questions by clicking on Q&A in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Just type your question in and select Ask, and we'll do our best to provide as many answers as possible through the program. Joining us today are two knowledgeable planners who will help us sort through these issues. It's my pleasure to introduce Brian Ross and David Morley. Brian Ross is principal and owner of CR Planning in Minneapolis, where he leads his firm's work in community and stakeholder-based planning processes, sustainable development planning, and energy policy. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
David Morley is a senior research associate with the American Planning Association in Chicago, where he serves as APA's Planning Advisory Service Coordinator, co-editor of Zoning Practice, and project manager for APA's Solar Ops efforts. Welcome, David.
Glad to be here.
Brian, I want to pose the first question to you. Why is it important for communities to consider solar energy use through the lens of planning?
Well, I'm going to start at with my conclusions. Always a good place. The important thing, I think, to remember is that we want everyone to take away with when we look at solar development and planning for solar development is that solar energy is a valuable local resource. In other words, that it's something that we shouldn't overlook. It has equal economic value to people. And it should be treated in regard to planning similar to other resources. People in your community will want to take advantage of their solar resources. And solar development, like other development, is ultimately a locally regulated land use with synergies and conflicts with other resources, as has already been noted. The way that we as a as a community typically deal with that is we create plans that set the stage for how the community can maximize development opportunity and minimize development risks. And that's what we want to do with solar development as well, and we need to think about that as a resource and as a development process, just like we do other kinds of resources. And my screen seems to be going a lot slower than others, so I'm not sure which slide we're on now. Okay, that looks like, okay, that now went too far. Sorry. So as I noted, solar is a local resource that has synergies and conflicts with other resources. Planners know how to plan for things like industrial assets, natural systems, productive farmland, and they routinely do it in the planning process. You go out, you do inventories, you identify what are the opportunities here that the community wants to achieve through these things, how it might come into conflict with other resources, and it is addressed in the plan. Similarly, planning needs to address solar resources in the same way, and we need to think about that and understand solar as a resource and what its characteristics are rather than trying to address it after the fact when solar development actually starts to occur in our community. So the kind of elements that planners need to think about in regard to solar development include a geographic element. What does the resource look like on the landscape? Where is it located? There's a technology element which is related to how the resource is harvested. There's different technologies to harvest your solar resource. They have different land use implications, different nuisances, different opportunities associated with them, and different economic development impacts. And then finally, of course, the market element, which is really how does the community think about solar as an economic development tool? What are the economic benefits that are associated with the solar resource and its development? And how do you want to capture that as you move forward in development in your community over the next 20 or 30 years? So I'm going to focus mainly on the geographic element of that because I think that's the most important thing to really have people understand. And what we see here is the map of the solar resource in the United States. And you can see that it stretches from a red, which is an excellent resource, down to a blue, which is a little bit more of a marginal resource in the United States. But we do have a map here that shows the country of Germany next to the United States, and you can see that the solar resource there is almost entirely worse than it is in the United States. The best resource in Germany is barely as good as the worst resource in the United States. And Germany is the country in the world that has dramatically more solar installations and more solar capacity than any other place, any other country on the planet. And they have dramatically changed the nature of their energy industry in terms of the amount of total energy that they get from solar energy. So as a consequence, you can see the United States has a large solar resource, and almost every community in the United States has a decent solar resource by this standard. And what you see, what you're looking at when you look at that map is the how the solar resource has been measured by when the sun is shining, day versus night, what kind of season it is when the sun is high in the sky versus low in the sky, and local weather patterns. When is it cloudy, when is it not cloudy? And that map takes all of those things into consideration, which gives you a great sense across the nation how you see a variability in your solar resource. But the one thing that it doesn't show, and it is most important perhaps when we look at this as a community resource, is that local landscape actually has greater impacts on the solar resource than any of those other things that I just said. So you would think that the solar resource would be defined by whether or not you're in a state with where the sun is high in the sky in the summer versus lower in the sky, like with some of the northern tier. And actually what we find is that the variability of assigned that goes along with that kind of a variable is less than simple shading impacts. A shaded solar panel down in Arizona doesn't work any better than a shaded solar panel in Portland. And so local impacts are actually probably the largest single impact that you have on terms of your measuring your solar resource. And again, my slides have seem to have stopped again. I'm not sure which one we're on. We need to be on the one that says the solar resource landscape defines whether a given site is a solar resource?
Yes.
Is that where we are? Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. The elements that define a local landscape, the local landscape elements include topography, on-site obstructions on the same site as the solar panel, such as buildings and trees, right? Vegetation, obstructions on the sites adjacent to or generally south of where you have your panel located itself, which again is going to be trees and buildings primarily, and future obstructions, because we are making an infrastructural decision here when we put in the solar panel, and we have to look not only what kind of shading impacts we're going to have today, but also what kind of shading impacts we're going to have in 20 years. Is that tree next door to our house going to grow up and shade the panel and during the panel's lifetime? And that's an important question. And so really what we need to do is to understand what a solar resource is define it as a location that is unshaded for several hours every day, usually around solar noon, both now and into the future. And when you start thinking about the solar resource as having those kinds of characteristics, all of a sudden you realize that it is something that's mappable within your community. And now I need to be on the solar map slide.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. What you see here is the light rail corridor between the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul as it was mapped out in the solar resource. Now, if you looked at this map just from the standpoint of the insulation, solar insulation, it would be completely uniform because the weather patterns are the same across the entire landscape. The night and day patterns are the same. The seasonal patterns are the same. There is no difference between from one end of this map to the other in terms of those patterns. But you can see when we put topography in, which we have done in this particular slide, in the previous slide actually, you begin to see some patterns of where the solar resource is and where it is not. You can see that it's still mainly uniform, but you can see some characteristics where there's bluffs, where there's a river, where there's an interstate highway that's in a ditch and there's a change in topography across the landscape. But when you go to the next slide, you then see we put in buildings, and you can see the pretty tremendous impact there is on the solar resource. You can now suddenly see where the downtowns are in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area. And even the street pattern, which is not showing up because we put in the street pattern, but because buildings and trees follow the infrastructure of local streets, and therefore the shading pattern also follows the impacts of local streets. So we can see how a street actually comes into play as a piece of infrastructure that can enable a solar resource to be available for development and where it is not available for development. So this is kind of a demonstration of what happens with the local impacts. Okay, now go to the next slide. We kind of having that local landscape defined in terms of access to the solar resource, you then have to start thinking about some of the technological elements for how you harvest that. And that is going to be affected by the resource location, the resource quality, and the desired energy use. We do see certain resources or certain types of technologies that require a higher quality solar resource than others, usually for economic reasons, such as if you're doing a solar farm and you're trying to sell power into the wholesale grid. You want to maximize the resource value, and you're not going to put it where there's a marginal resource, a solar resource. If you're putting it on a home, the homeowner may be more able to or willing to deal with a more marginal resource in terms of making that installation decision. And also there's some differences between photovoltaic and solar thermal resources. Okay, go to the next. I'm sorry. Is that...
Staying with this idea of thinking of solar energy as a community resource, Brian, what are some of the broad effects that solar development can have on a community?
The solar development, like other kinds of development, is really not an end in itself. So, when we build housing, we have pro-housing goals and pro-development goals. What we're trying to do is accommodate population growth or build a tax base, create jobs for contractors and local industries, et cetera. It's not an end in itself. And solar development is also not an end in itself. So in terms of kind of the planning goals we look at, typically we see two kinds of goals that that solar development helps the community accomplish, which includes environmental goals and economic goals. Environmental goals usually are related to some bigger picture environmental goals. For instance, climate action goals. A lot of cities have started to incorporate or develop climate action plans where they minimize their greenhouse gas emissions. And local solar development is one of the ways in which we can actually have an impact where there's local control that can help the community meet its climate action goals. Similarly, sustainability plans or energy plans, or, as we're seeing more and more, comprehensive plans that actually include these elements in them are important goals that can be achieved through solar development, through enabling solar development to occur in the community and taking advantage of the solar resources that are in the community. So from an environmental standpoint, we really look at these kinds of big picture environmental goals that a community frequently sets in order to help achieve those goals for the community. Similarly, we have economic goals. And this is something that sometimes gets lost in the discussion about solar energy at the local level, is that this is an economic development measure just like any other kind of development. People will talk about housing development and talk about the jobs it creates. Solar development also creates jobs. And in fact, we have here, and I didn't get time to update it because this is from Tracking the Sun 2011 version. I think there is now, just in the last few days, they came out with a new 2012 version, so I should update this graph. But nevertheless, this is illustrative of a point. When we look at the total kind of jobs that are created nationally from the solar industry, people tend to think about the manufacturing jobs and how many plants are we building, how many jobs are we creating, and that's very important. However, the bulk of the jobs occurs at the installation level. And this is always going to be a local job. You can't export installation jobs to China. You must have that as local capacity for your contractors and your developers. And this is where the bulk of economic development, bulk of economic benefit is to the local level in terms of solar development through these creation of new jobs or allowing existing contractors to expand their markets and diversify their products. And thus make jobs more stable within your community that are usually pretty good-paying jobs.
Well, I think this helps explain why solar energy is a planning issue. David, how might a planning perspective help communities in their efforts to promote solar energy use?
Well, first off, I want to highlight that and stress that planners are trained to approach issues comprehensively. Now, what this means is that we focus on how different issues and systems relate to each other. We're thinking about how changes in land use affect transportation needs and about how transportation investments shape future land use. We're thinking about how the built environment and economic activities affect the natural environment and public health, and about how land use, housing choice, and transportation all affect local economies. So basically, we're thinking about how to best engage diverse populations in planning processes that affect their future health and welfare, and about how to chart a course for future growth and change that's going to lead to increased prosperity and social equity. Now, planners are also trained to be future-oriented. So what will be the long-term effects of a particular course of action or inaction? So while it can be difficult for elected officials to look beyond the next election cycles, planners have a responsibility, and they're one of very few people at the local level that are specifically charged with analyzing and discussing how decisions made at one point in time are likely to create or constrain opportunities 10 or 20 or even 30 years down the road. Now, this doesn't mean that planners have a crystal ball, but I don't think that many people would say we shouldn't be paying attention to environmental, demographic, social, or economic trends in order to help improve our decision-making. For example, it's hard to predict exactly what the long-term impacts of global climate change may be for a particular local community, but it seems like a safe bet that planning for potential impacts today will minimize costs down the road. Basically, I think that viewing solar energy use through the lens of planning means taking a step back and considering how a wide range of community goals and priorities relate to the idea of taking advantage of local solar resources. Now, this is what Brian was talking about earlier. The figure on screen is showing a range of broad goals that a community that's interested in becoming more sustainable might embrace. And solar energy use often feeds into a larger strategy for achieving one or more of these broad goals. So playing off of what Brian said, growing the local solar market can be an important part of a wider focus on building local economic resilience or achieving greater harmony with nature. In communities that have air quality issues related to coal-fired power plants, an effort to promote solar power could be directly related to public health goals. There's even a case to be made that community solar programs contribute to social equity, because community solar programs help renters and other folks that can't afford to purchase their own installation buy shares of a local solar project.
So, David, what are some opportunities that planners and other planning process participants might have to initiate a community conversation about solar energy use?
Well, to be honest, I think the idea of community planning can sometimes seem really diffuse. I mean, communities care about so many different issues, and there are so many different discrete decision-making processes that I think the big picture can get a little fuzzy. That's why I think it can be helpful to think of 5 strategic points of intervention in a community's planning system where planners, local officials, and other stakeholders can start a dialogue about solar energy use. Now, the first strategic point of intervention is community visioning and goal setting. A visioning process is often the first step in any long-range planning effort. Basically, the point of visioning is to have a broad conversation about what a community wants to be like in the future. So this can be an ideal time for planners and other participants to gauge their community's interest in and awareness of solar. Now, it's also a great opportunity to discuss how solar connects to other community goals. Visioning processes often include public meetings as well as other engagement tools like websites and community surveys. And now the explicit intent is usually to involve as many people as possible in the conversation. So it makes sense that this is maybe the best single opportunity to begin talking about the role solar energy might play in a community's future. The second strategic point of intervention is plan making. Communities make a lot of different types of plans, but to keep it simple, I've grouped them in 3 broad categories here. There are comprehensive plans, which are also known as general plans or master plans in different parts of the country. These are the single most important policy document for local governments. They're comprehensive both in terms of geography, because they cover an entire city or county, and in terms of the range of topics they cover. Now, while the specific topics tend to be broader in some states than in others, they often cover land use, transportation, economic development, housing, community facilities, and the environment. And many communities, as Brian alluded to, chose to include chapters on other topics too, like natural hazards, energy, or health. In some ways, local comprehensive plans are like a community constitution. Then there are sub-area plans. These are plans that focus on some contiguous area within a particular city or county. The most common examples are plans for specific neighborhoods or corridors. Sometimes sub-area plans are topically comprehensive, and sometimes they take a more detailed look at one or more issues, like urban design or revitalization. And finally, there are functional plans. These are plans that focus on a specific topic, like housing, transportation networks, or park systems. And over the past several years, lots of communities have created new functional plans that deal with climate change, sustainability, or energy. And in many cases, these plans have inspired conversations about solar energy use. While developing local plans, planners and other stakeholders have a chance to talk about both the current state of the local solar market, and they have opportunities to highlight how specific goals, objectives, policies, and actions in a particular plan may help or hurt individual or collective efforts to take advantage of local solar resources. The third strategic point of intervention is regulations and incentives. Local development regulations and incentive programs have an important influence on what, where, and how things get built, and what, where, and how land and buildings are preserved. So, as a community starts to consider an update to its zoning, subdivision, or building codes, planners and other key community stakeholders have a chance to discuss how any proposed changes might make it easier or harder to install solar energy systems. Now, this also means they have a chance to open up a wider conversation about why that even matters. In a practical sense, development regulations are also one of the most important tools that local governments have to minimize potential conflicts between the use of solar resources and the use or conservation of other community resources like trees or historic structures. So the process of developing new zoning regulations can also be a great time to talk about how potentially competing priorities will be balanced in a spatial sense. Now, the fourth strategic point of intervention is development work. When I say development work, I'm thinking of real estate development projects of all types, from a basic home addition all the way up to a new neighborhood or town center. In some cases, the opportunity for dialogue about solar might be a simple one-on-one conversation over the permit counter, and I think in a lot of communities, these over-the-counter interactions are where most property owners form their impressions of the local planning system. While each individual interaction might seem somewhat insignificant, these interactions, they add up over time. But the conversation about solar could also happen in a lively public debate over a large-scale development project. For example, let's say a solar developer submits a proposal for a new farm in a community that hasn't seen a solar farm before and maybe doesn't have much experience with large-scale solar projects. So just the fact that this is a novel thing may in itself lead to a wider conversation about the effects of solar development on the community. The fifth and final strategic point of intervention is public investment. So towns, cities, and counties, they all undertake major investments in infrastructure and community facilities that support private development and quality of life in their communities. I've listed some of these things here on your screen. And as a community evaluates alternative investments, there are opportunities to discuss why solar energy systems should or shouldn't be incorporated into these projects.
Brian, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, just to kind of take a step back for a second and again talk about why all this why we're talking about all this detail in the first place. One of our goals here in this project is really to develop a kind of self-sustaining solar energy market. And unlike other energy kind of resources and energy generation resources in particular, solar energy is local and decentralized all the time. That is always the case, that every community has a resource and that solar development, that local government holds a lot of the keys to how development occurs in that community. And I just wanted to kind of talk about how local government actions here fit within the overall development of solar energy markets. There's a lot of work going on to address other aspects of that people may or may not have heard about. For instance, the solar panels themselves have a conversion efficiency that they have a lot of physicists and a lot of chemists working on to try to improve that. The market efficiency of a solar panel is something like ranges from 15 to 24% right now. And there's people trying to bump that up over 30% and higher, and that will help, of course, and make solar energy a more viable resource as the panel conversion efficiency goes up. Similarly, manufacturing costs are a lot of people working to make that more efficient, and we've driven manufacturing costs over the last 20 years down from something like $10 a watt down to about 60 cents a watt, which is a dramatic increase just from increases in manufacturing efficiencies. Installation efficiencies. This is where the contractors themselves get better and better at putting in a solar installation quickly and efficiently and at low cost. And that there's a whole series of efforts around kind of installation technologies that will make it go in, solar installations work better. And then we start talking about things like regulatory barriers, which are in the way of solar development, and access questions about actually getting to the solar resource and making sure that people can get to those. And this is the province of local government. All of the studies about creating a self-sustaining solar energy market have identified these two elements as key. If we cannot limit regulatory barriers, or I should say unnecessary regulatory barriers, in the marketplace, and if we cannot make sure that people have access to the solar resources that they want to develop, all the rest of the stuff will be in vain. And so local government is a key player, is a critical player, is an essential player to the development ultimately of solar energy markets that are self-sustaining and that allow us to move forward and kind of make solar energy part of our energy portfolio.
Staying with you, Brian, what are some specific tools that communities can use to help build awareness about solar energy use?
I think that we need to talk about two different kinds of public engagement tools around solar energy, and David has already talked pretty extensively about the importance of engaging the community on policy initiatives. When we do comprehensive planning, making sure people understand solar is a part of that. When we're doing development regulation, helping the community understand what place that takes in the community, and those kinds of civic engagement activities around policy are one of the critical ways that we really need to, that we help the community understand the value of the resource and the implications of solar development. But there are some other things that people can do, or that communities can do, in terms of education about solar resources to help residents and businesses really understand what their opportunities are. And there's a number of templates out there that can be used. There's workshops that can be put on that tend to actually get a pretty good draw when you say you're going to do a workshop around solar energy, and people will come to it to find out what they can do and what this new thing is all about in their community. Well, new in some areas of the country anyway. Another aspect that we have that seems to get a big draw is technology fairs. That people love technology, and if you emphasize the technology, you can get them in the room and start talking about the kind of things that may not be necessarily associated with the technology, such as how solar as a resource fits within the community, and how people do have or do not have a resource on their property, and how they might go about doing that, which is also greatly facilitated by what some communities have done in terms of web-based solar mapping, which has turned out to be a pretty interesting tool for engaging people directly on this concept of solar resources. And just to kind of focus on that momentarily, the web-based resource, on the left we have that kind of generalized solar map of the United States that people, you say, what is the solar resource? And people can look at this in the community and say, I'm in North Dakota. There's our solar resource. Or you could show them a map that shows the level of detail on the right, where they actually see a street that they know is theirs, and they say, there's my building. There's my rooftop. There's a solar resource on top of it. Now, obviously, the one on the right is one that's going to engage them far greater and help them understand the resource far differently than the one on the left. And this is something that a lot of communities have actually done, because most communities now have the basic tools to start to do the kind of thing that you see on the right. The first step in the process usually is to kind of do that solar assessment within GIS, to do the topography analysis, which is what you see here, so that people can start to see where there is a resource and where there's not a resource within their community on a level that they can recognize and understand, and then to start doing things like understanding where there might be restrictions or conflicts. And in this case, we're seeing the community put in its wooded and wetland areas, the kind of areas that it wants to preserve from a standpoint of urban forest and parks and open space and the like. And they discovered that a good number of those good solar resources were actually in areas that are forested. And what does that mean? It means that it really isn't a resource. If it's forested, it's not a resource. If it isn't forested, it might be a resource. And so you can kind of see the areas of their community where there is a legitimate solar resource that individual property owners might be able to develop, and where there is not. And where this has ultimately been taken by some communities, and what we see here is a snapshot from the Renew Boston solar resource map, where they've done this all the way out to identifying where there's historic districts, where there's difficulties with the electric utility system, where solar is more difficult to install in some parts of the electric utility system than it is in other parts. And also to identify existing solar installations. So you can see here in this snapshot of their website where the historic districts lie under the blue part of the map, where there's going to be additional review if you put a solar system up in a historic district. The red section is where there's a utility consideration about installing solar that will lead to a more difficult installation. And then in the other parts of the map, you can see different color groups that show different solar potentials, and there's actually in that box, you may not be able to see it very clearly, but that's the Find Your Address box that enables a specific user to find the solar potential at a specific location. They can go to their building, find what the solar resource is and what the limitations are on it, and even have a calculation of how much power is going to be potentially distributed and what the cost savings of that might be. This is something that is really helps people understand that kind of resource component of the solar in a way that they're going to be interested in and that will generate interest in solar development.
Those are some great resources. David, are we leaving anything out?
Well, I think that really does cover a lot of ground, but I wanted to maybe be a little bit provocative and point out some other things that I think can kind of do double duty as engagement tools. I know there could be some skeptics out there that might have a hard time seeing a database as a conversation tool, but I guess I want to argue that property databases are really underused in a lot of communities. Now, when I say a property database, what I'm talking about is a database with information about every legal lot of record in a community. I don't actually know if the solar suitability tool that Brian was showing us in Boston, if they have integrated this with their real property database, but it looks like it is close. So some cities use these databases to track problem properties or to monitor vacant land, and a lot of communities make some portion of their property databases visible to the general public through a web interface. So with this in mind, there's no reason why a city couldn't combine information about ownership and land use with information about the quality of the solar resource on the site. So imagine being able to look up both the zoning and the solar suitability of a particular parcel through the same web portal. Now, the second item I've listed here probably makes more intuitive sense as an engagement tool. Demonstration projects can be a way for local governments to raise awareness about specific technologies or deployment options, while at the same time producing heat or electricity that can be used to offset some public energy consumption. Because these demonstration projects are often sponsored or owned by private companies, it can be a low-cost way for the city or the county to test both solar benefits and public reactions. And the last thing I've listed here is really an extension of this demonstration project idea. So, as I mentioned earlier, when local governments consider incorporating solar into capital projects, the decision-making process provides an opportunity for discussion and debate. That's true. But a second angle is that the solar installations themselves can spark questions and conversation simply because of their high public visibility. So both temporary demonstration projects and permanent public installations can both be used as teaching tools in some ways. It can be as simple as providing an informational kiosk or website that shows how much energy is being generated over time, or it could actually involve a formal curriculum, like for an installation at a school.
As we come to the end of our discussion today, I wanted to give you both a chance to weigh in with some final advice for communities who may be just starting to think about planning for solar energy use. Brian, what are some steps communities can take to be more solar friendly?
What we really talk about from the standpoint of kind of planning and solar friendliness is that there are kind of four components that communities need to look at in terms of assessing their own receptivity to solar development. And that would be in their comprehensive plans, in their development regulations, in their permitting processes, and in the level of public sector investment that they've made in their own resources. The comprehensive plans, of course, to be solar friendly, you need to have a comprehensive plan that addresses solar resources and acknowledges that solar development has a place in the community and there are opportunities from it. Acknowledging that benefit in the comprehensive plan, which is, of course, the foundation for all of the policy foundation for all the work that we do in regard to development within the community, is really critical to kind of being a solar-friendly community. Second, and some of this David has already covered, or actually a lot of it David has already covered, but kind of just to reemphasize it, that we need to have development regulations that explicitly acknowledge solar development in its varied forms. And in particular, that we need to have development regulations that create an as-of-right installation opportunity for people who have solar resources. one that doesn't require them to go to get a conditional use permit in every single instance, one that they know if they do it a particular way that they can just go down and they can get their permits and they can go ahead. And then also the development regulations that set clear and predictable standards, as David has already noted, for balancing solar resources with other resources. How are you going to balance your solar development against protection of your historic resources? How are you going to incorporate solar development into natural resource protection or into, urban forest protection? These are things that if you think about ahead of time, you can set some standards to make those decisions so that contractors can know where the landscape is. Similarly, in terms of the permitting process, every single bit of local development that occurs has to get some kind of a local permit. And what you want to strive for in a solar-friendly community is having a predictable and clear process with submittal requirements clearly laid out, review timeframes understood, and permit fees that are predictable. And we've seen a lot of problems, usually inadvertent problems, but in permitting processes at the local level, where every time a contractor goes in, the guy behind the counter is asking for a different set of submittal requirements, or that the review time frame is not clear, and the contractor is twiddling their thumbs and having to make extra trips out because the inspector wasn't sure whether or not they needed to do a pre-inspection and a post-inspection, or is a final inspection enough, and different decisions being made. And similarly, permit fees. That just in my state of Minnesota, we've seen permit fees range in some places from $0 up to $800. And for the same kind of installation, and that obviously has an enormous impact on the installer, the contractor's profitability. And then finally, of course, as David just went over, public sector investment in the community's own resources to demonstrate viability of the resource, community commitment to the resource, and various kinds of technological elements that need to be considered in solar development.
Thanks, Brian. David, do you have any parting thoughts for our audience?
Well, first, I think it's important to highlight just how important policy is to growing local solar markets. Over the past decade or so, as Brian mentioned, we've had major improvements in solar technology and supply chains that have already led to dramatic decreases in installation costs. But even with that, there are still high upfront equipment costs and installation costs that keep a lot of folks from investing in solar energy systems. So in a lot of places, solar electric rates are still higher than conventional fuel rates. What this winds up meaning is that federal and state financial incentives are really helpful in driving growth in the U.S. solar market. Also, state and local utility regulations, along with utility business models, affect the extent of utility investments in solar energy. They control when and how solar PV systems, at least, can connect to the power grid. And they determine the price and individual utility, and they determine prices that individual utilities are willing to pay for the power that's getting produced. So far, solar policy experts have focused almost all of their attention on these sort of macro-scale issues, but I think it's really important to stress that local policy matters when it comes to solar energy use, too. Even though most local governments aren't likely to be able to have a really dramatic effect on the hard costs associated with purchasing solar systems. As Brian was mentioning, the local land use and economic development policies can still have dramatic effects on the soft costs associated with solar development. So the next two webinars in this series, we're going to be taking a closer look at how silence and local plans and development regulations can pose unintentional barriers to solar energy use. Perhaps this is the single best reason for opening up a wider community conversation about solar. I also want to reemphasize that viewing solar energy use through the lens of planning means thinking about how solar relates to other community goals. As Brian pointed out, solar is not usually a goal in and of itself. It has a relationship to other goals. So it puts solar energy use in the context of how a community wants to grow and change over time. Obviously, it's possible to think about strategies for promoting solar market growth in isolation from other community goals and priorities, but I think there are risks associated with that. First of all, there's the risk that you could be working at cross purposes with another goal. And I think there's a chance that there may always seem like there's something more urgent to think about, something more urgent on the local policy agenda. That's why I think it makes sense to be more opportunistic. And that's what leads me to the last point I want to make today is I hope you've gotten the sense by now that I think there are lots of ways to start or revisit a community conversation about using local solar resources. I don't think that your community needs to be at the beginning of a long-range planning process to evaluate the role that solar might play in its future, and I don't think it needs to have a special series of forums limited to discussing solar and only solar. Instead, I think it's important to take advantage of the various strategic decision points I spoke about earlier. Approaching solar energy use with a planning perspective means being prepared to facilitate community conversations about solar in a wide variety of settings, and that includes formal development review hearings all the way down to casual informational meetings.
Thanks, David. Now, for the remainder of our time today, we'd like to take some questions from our audience. As a reminder, you can submit your questions by clicking on Q&A in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. Looks like we have some questions coming in. Here's the first one. What are some examples of unnecessary regulatory barriers for solar?
Brian, do you want to jump on that one?
Sure. Some examples in terms of kind of basic zoning issues include treatment of rooftop solar installations as a piece of rooftop equipment. And what we typically see in a lot of a lot of zoning ordinances is that when there's a piece of rooftop equipment that has that is addressed generically, it requires screening. Well, what happens when you screen a solar system? You make it useless. Kind of understanding how that we need to treat solar installations and solar technologies according to their according to the use that they're bringing to the property, and not inadvertently include them in some category that's going to inappropriately regulate them to the point where they are not useful. That's just one example of how we do see some fairly typical difficulties in existing zoning regulation if you're not addressing solar specifically within your development regulations.
And I also want to put in a plug here. Actually, the third webinar in this webinar series is going to be taking a much more in-depth look at the relationships between local development regulations and solar energy use. So I encourage you to tune in for that on November 1st.
Great. Okay, here's our second question. We are interested in having a workshop for our residents on the benefits of installing solar at their homes. What types of experts should we invite to the workshop, and what sort of information will give residents the highest value?
Well, I'll say a little bit at first here. So I think it definitely makes sense to have some folks in the room that really understand some basics of the technology. Now, that might be somebody actually from the solar industry, but I don't think it has to be. I think it's relatively easy to get up to speed on the basics of the technology. And I think it's especially helpful to have some folks in the room that are working on the installation side. So some people that maybe have tried to go through the process of installing solar, or who have installed solar either in your community or in nearby communities, so that they can speak specifically about some of the challenges that they faced, or talk through some of the ways in which they approached a certain situation. And Brian, I'm sure you have some other ideas too.
Yeah, and it does depend on kind of where you're at, which state you're in, and kind of what your community is about. We have seen some people who have gotten great benefit in these kind of workshops out of having someone who can talk about finance. Because these systems are very capital intensive, and they require a fairly large amount of capital to come forward, even if you're getting a lot of incentives. A lot of times you have to come up with the capital up front, and you get the incentive kind of either as a production incentive or as a tax refund, or as a rebate from a utility company, but it doesn't happen up front. So kind of having someone who understands the interplay of capital and financing so that the homeowner can understand kind of what that is. And also I think it's always good to have some people from the installation community come and talk, but you need to make sure that one of the things that they talk about are that not everybody has a solar resource, a viable solar resource on their home or business, and it's always good to get a third-party assessment, if you can, of that solar resource, so that there's no doubt that if you're making that big of an investment, you actually have something that's viable to capture.
Great. Those are some great tips on putting together a workshop. Our next question talks about different types of solar energy uses. How much of this discussion relates to solar for electric generation versus solar for heating water or air for an individual building? Since almost all is local, it seems that the latter has significant potential.
I'll take a shot at that. A lot of the work that's going on now in kind of this market transformation, these market transformation efforts, is focused on the solar electric, the photovoltaic side of the solar equation. However, a lot of the local government stuff that we're talking about in terms of limiting soft costs and enabling people to use their resources apply equally to all forms of solar development. There are some differences in terms of the way, for instance, a solar thermal system needs to be put on a building versus a solar electric system that does sometimes have an impact on how you write your development regulations. And so you need to be cognizant of that. I always urge people to kind of look at the full range of resource questions from the standpoint of different technologies. That a single electric or a telephone wire, the shadow of a telephone wire across a PV panel can, in many cases, almost shut the panel down. So, that tiny bit of shading is very important. For a solar thermal panel, it's not that important because you shade 10% of the panel, you lose 10% of the production. It's kind of the way it works. Similarly for, kind of passive solar, for heating solar walls and the likelihood, a little bit of shading doesn't matter. But there are larger aesthetic questions usually because those systems are usually bigger and have more visual impact on the community, and which in some communities is a big deal.
Thanks, Brian. We usually hear about solar PV, so it's great to bring solar water heating into the conversation as well. The next question we have also focuses on different types of solar uses. I know the SunShot program primarily focuses on rooftop solar installation. However, can you discuss starting the conversation about the land use compatibility of ground-mounted systems at commercial and utility scales?
Well, I'll jump in and say something at first here and then let Brian finish it off. But I think that there is a higher degree of risk that you're going to be walking into a contentious conversation when you're talking about a large-scale system. But really what that says to me is that really makes the case all the more clear that you really want to be thinking about this early in your planning processes, and you want to be thinking about this before that solar farm developer shows up in your community and says, this is what I want to do. So that makes a great case for bringing it up in a long-range planning process and for thinking through the relationship between different goals and how they impact solar energy use up front, and then ideally, and I grant that this is a highly idealized situation, but then you might even take the step of mapping out the areas in your community that are most appropriate for large-scale facilities and maybe the areas where you really want to see large-scale facilities locate. Now, I'm kind of skirting the compatibility question there. I'm going to let Brian do the hard work of talking about that. But there really is a big difference when you're talking about a ground-mounted small system in somebody's backyard versus a ground-mounted solar farm. And
we have in the SunShot kind of work, DOE SunShot work that we did here in Minnesota, we found that we ended up working with some county governments, and of course they're far more interested in talking about things like solar farms than in rooftop installations. They're not too concerned from a regulatory standpoint of what happens on someone's roof. They are concerned about whether or not, for instance, in counties here in Minnesota, you're putting a solar farm on prime farmland, or that you're putting a solar farm in a place where it's going to create a groundwater problem because you haven't addressed runoff from the site. And those are things that don't come into play when you're doing a rooftop installation, even a very large rooftop installation, because it's already impervious surface, for instance, or it already has visual impacts that are really not going to be affected that much. So there are a whole host of different issues from a land use planning standpoint and compatibility standpoint that need to be addressed when you start talking about solar as a primary or principal use versus solar as an accessory use. And it's all the more important to think about solar as development when you're talking about it as a principal use or primary use. There are also, in the same sense that we can learn a lot of things from the wind industry about this in terms of kind of dealing with real problems versus perceived problems and how that might affect solar development in your community, as well as, again, from the wind industry, and as David has already mentioned, identifying areas where you might want this type of development to occur. I mean, there are some communities that have actually put in wind energy overlays for the purpose of protecting the wind resource in those areas from inappropriate development because they want to see wind farms go in there. And you can do the same thing with solar. I think I've seen a couple of communities, a couple of counties that have done that across the United States in various spots. I haven't done an inventory of it, but it does happen. So these are the kind of differences, some of the differences between primary and accessory use.
All right. Well, for the sake of time, we'll let that be our final word. I want to thank our panelists, Brian Ross and David Morley, for a great discussion and our audience for some great questions. And I want to remind everyone that this webinar is the first part of a three-part series, so we hope you'll join us for the next program, Promoting Solar Energy Use Through Local Plans, on September 20th. At this point, we're going to post a brief survey on your screen. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to provide your feedback. We appreciate any feedback you can provide, as it is used to help improve future webinar programming. Thank you for doing so. Also, thank you for being with us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. This concludes today's program.